March 15th, 1943. Schweinfurt, Germany. Major Robert Morgan gripped the yoke of his B-24 Liberator as flak bursts painted black flowers across the sky at 25,000 feet. In the nose compartment below him, Bombardier Lieutenant James Chen hunched over the Norden bomb site, the device the military had told them could put a bomb in a pickle barrel from 4 miles up. Chen's voice crackled through the intercom. "Bomb run initiated. I have the aircraft." For the next 3 minutes, the Norden's gyroscopes would fly the plane, making microscopic corrections as Chen tracked the target through the site's optics. The entire bomber stream, 291 B-24 seconds carrying 698 tons of ordnance, would release on his mark. The ball-bearing factories below, vital to German war production, would cease to exist, except they didn't. Post-strike reconnaissance revealed what would become the dirty secret of high-altitude strategic bombing. Of 698 tons dropped, only 88 tons fell within 1,000 feet of the aiming point, a 12.6% accuracy rate. The ball-bearing factories continued production with minimal interruption. 36 B-24 seconds didn't return. 218 men killed or captured for a target that remained operational. What Major Morgan didn't know, what the Air Force was desperately concealing from Congress, the public, and increasingly from itself, was that the Norden bomb site, the classified device that had cost $1.5 billion to develop and $8,000 per unit to manufacture, had a fatal flaw. It assumed perfect conditions that never existed in combat. The Norden Mark 15 bomb site seemed like magic in 1943, 30 pounds of precision-machined brass, steel, and aluminum. 2,000 individual parts assembled by workers with security clearances. Bombardiers took oaths to destroy the device rather than let it fall into enemy hands. German and Japanese intelligence considered it the single most valuable piece of American military technology. The theory was elegant. The Bombardier would identify the target visually, input the aircraft's altitude, airspeed, and wind drift. The Norden's gyroscopes, spinning at 7,200 revolutions per minute, would stabilize the site independent of the aircraft's movement. As the plane approached the target, the Bombardier would track the aiming point through the telescope. When the crosshairs aligned perfectly, the Norden would automatically release the bombs, calculating the precise trajectory to account for gravity, wind, and the aircraft's forward motion. In testing at Muroc Dry Lake, California, Bombardiers regularly achieved accuracy of 75 feet from 20,000 feet. The publicity films showed bombs marching into target circles with mechanical precision. Carl Norden himself, the Dutch immigrant engineer who had spent 15 years perfecting the device, testified to Congress that his site would make aerial bombing a precision science, not an area attack. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Air Force built its entire strategic doctrine around this capability. The theory of precision daylight bombing assumed that American bombers, flying at altitudes where German fighters struggled and flak was dispersed, would surgically destroy specific industrial targets. No need for the British approach of nighttime area bombing. American technology would win the war without killing civilians. Colonel Curtis LeMay, then commander of the 305th Bomb Group, believed it absolutely. His pre-war training at Maxwell Field had emphasized the Norden's capabilities. Every bombardier spent 100 hours in the trainer, a device that cost more than the bomber itself. "Give me bombardiers who can use the Norden properly," LeMay told his staff in August 1943, "and I'll put every bomb within 500 feet of any target in Germany." What worked at Muroc Dry Lake in clear California sunshine fell apart over the Ruhr Valley in winter. Lieutenant Harrison Gerber, bombardier with the 93rd Bomb Group, kept a private log that wouldn't be declassified until 1978. His entry from October 14, 1943, the second Schweinfurt raid, captured the growing disillusionment. Another maximum effort. 291 aircraft. Target obscured by cloud deck from 18,000 to 24,000 feet. Bombed on radar estimate through clouds. Results unknown but likely scattered. Norden useless when you can't see the target. Lost 60 aircraft. 20% of the force. For what? The problems multiplied. Weather. Over Germany, cloud cover existed 70% of the time. The Norden required visual contact with the target. When clouds intervened, bombardiers either bombed on estimate using radar approximations or brought their bombs home. The miracle site became a 30-pound paperweight. Defensive maneuvers. The Norden assumed straight and level flight, but German fighters and flak forced constant evasive action. Every turn, every altitude change invalidated the site's calculations. Bombardiers would spend 5 minutes setting up the perfect solution, only to have a burst of flak force the pilot to break the bomb run. Human factors. At 25,000 feet over Germany in winter, cockpit temperatures dropped to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Bombardiers wore electrically heated suits that frequently malfunctioned. Frostbite was common. Oxygen deprivation at altitude caused judgment errors. Men would pass out at their stations. The Norden's complex calculations required clear thinking that was often impossible. Mechanical limits. The site's gyroscopes, those marvels of precision engineering, proved fragile. Combat vibration threw them out of alignment. One burst of flak nearby could render the site useless for the entire mission. Maintenance crews couldn't recalibrate them in the field. A $8,000 device became scrap metal. Most devastating was the revelation hidden in the classified operational research section reports. Actual combat accuracy averaged 3.2% of bombs within 1,000 feet of the aiming point, not the 75% achieved in testing, not even the 50% promised in training. Single-digit accuracy. Major General Haywood Hansell, chief architect of American strategic bombing doctrine, reviewed these reports in his office at 8th Air Force Headquarters in November 1943. His aide later recalled that Hansell, normally composed, swept the papers off his desk and sat in silence for 10 minutes. "Everything we've told Washington is wrong," Hansell finally said. "We're not conducting precision bombing. We're conducting expensive area attacks from high altitude, and we're losing men at rates we can't sustain for results we can't justify." By December 1943, the mathematics of strategic bombing had become catastrophic. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers faster than factories could replace them. Crew losses exceeded replacement rates, and targets remained operational. The campaign against German ball-bearing production, considered vital to grinding the cart, Wehrmacht to a halt, demonstrated the failure perfectly. Between August and October 1943, the 8th Air Force flew 4 maximum effort raids against Schweinfurt, losing 148 bombers and 1,480 men. German ball-bearing production dropped 38% for 6 weeks, then recovered completely. Albert Speer, German Minister of Armaments, would later testify that the attacks caused him serious concern for approximately 2 months. The dispersal of production and stockpiled reserves meant the Wehrmacht never suffered shortage. Meanwhile, the human cost mounted. 8th Air Force bomber crews faced a 20% probability of death per mission. With a 25-mission tour requirement, the mathematical chance of survival was nearly zero. Men flew knowing the odds. Lieutenant Philip Ardery, pilot with the 389th Bomb Group, wrote to his wife in December 1943. "They keep telling us the Norden will let us destroy Germany without the slaughter of area bombing, but we're the ones being slaughtered. We fly in perfect formations at 25,000 feet, so the bombardiers can use their miracle sights, and the flak batteries track us perfectly. We're predictable. And we're dying. There has to be a better way." There was, and it would come from an unlikely source: combat pilots ignoring orders. January 1944. Debden Airfield, England. Major James Howard commanded the 356th Fighter Squadron, flying P-51 Mustangs escorting B-24 seconds deep into Germany. Howard had noticed something the bomber commanders hadn't. When German fighters forced B-24 seconds to descend below 15,000 feet to escape, Bombardiers, who jettisoned their loads in panic, achieved better accuracy than planned high-altitude attacks. The reason was simple physics. At 12,000 feet, bombs spent less time in the air. Less time meant less opportunity for wind drift, calculation errors, or aircraft movement to throw them off course. The bombardiers couldn't use the Norden's complex calculations at low altitude during combat, so they aimed by eye, using the simpler Mark 9 sight. And they hit their targets. Howard mentioned this in his debriefing. The intelligence officer dismissed it as coincidence, but Lieutenant Colonel James Wilson, operations officer for the 93rd Bomb Group, had noticed the same pattern. Wilson was a mathematics instructor at Princeton before the war. He began analyzing mission reports, comparing altitude to accuracy. The correlation was undeniable. Lower altitude meant higher accuracy, even without the Norden. Wilson presented his findings to Colonel Addison Baker, the 93rd's commander. Baker was skeptical. Doctrine demanded high-altitude operations. Lower altitude meant exposure to light flak, small arms fire, and fighter attack. The Norden had cost billions to develop. Surely it worked better than eyeball aiming. Wilson explained. The Norden assumes perfect information. Exact altitude, exact airspeed, exact wind conditions. At 25,000 feet, slight errors in any variable multiply over the 5-mile bomb fall. At 12,000 feet, a bomb falls for 18 seconds, not 65 seconds. There's less time for errors to accumulate. Physics beats technology. Baker authorized an experiment. 1 squadron, 1 target, 1 mission at 12,000 feet, using visual aiming instead of the Norden. February 3rd, 1944. The target was the marshalling yards at Hamm, Germany. 12 B-24 seconds from the 93rd Bomb Group approached at 12,500 feet, far below the normal bombing altitude. The crews were terrified. At this height, they could see German soldiers on the ground. Flak burst seemed close enough to touch. Bombardier Lieutenant Robert Stevens didn't have time to use the Norden's complex calculations. As the marshalling yards appeared in his sight, he aimed using the simple crosshairs of the backup Mark 9 sight, adjusting by eye for the bomber's speed and altitude. A 3-second bomb run, not the 3-minute Norden procedure. Bombs away. The results, confirmed by photo reconnaissance that afternoon, shocked everyone. 46% of bombs fell within 1,000 feet of the aiming point. Some landed directly on rail junctions. The marshalling yard was shut down for 3 weeks. 46% accuracy. The Norden had never achieved better than 8% in combat conditions. Colonel Baker sent the results to 8th Air Force Headquarters with a simple message. Request permission to standardize low-altitude approach for precision targets. The response came back within 24 hours. Permission denied. High-altitude doctrine will be maintained. Norden sight procedures are not subject to field modification. But word spread among bomber crews. If low altitude meant better accuracy and potentially shorter missions, why were they flying into the teeth of heavy flak at 25,000 feet? The revolution was about to begin, not from the top down, but from the bottom up, driven by men who valued survival over doctrine. May 1943. North Africa. Colonel Jacob Smart stood in a tent that radiated heat like a furnace, studying aerial photographs of Ploiești, Romania. The oil refineries visible in the images produced 60% of Germany's crude oil. Destroy Ploiești, conventional wisdom held, and the Wehrmacht's panzers would run dry within months. Smart had been ordered to plan an attack that would accomplish what high-altitude precision bombing hadn't: complete destruction of a vital industrial target. He had 178 B-24 Liberators available, the largest bomber force ever assembled for a single target. He had the Norden bombsight, and he had a problem. Ploiești was 1,350 miles from the nearest Allied base, at the extreme range of the B-24. The refineries were surrounded by the heaviest concentration of anti-aircraft defences outside the Ruhr Valley. Intelligence estimated 237 heavy flak guns, including German 88mm batteries that could reach 30,000 feet. Ploesti had been attacked before, in July 1942, by 13 B-24 seconds from 20,000 feet. One bomb had hit a refinery. 13 bombs had hit the city. Refineries continued production uninterrupted. Smart was a West Point graduate, an aeronautical engineer, and an Air Force planner who understood numbers. He ran the calculations for a conventional high-altitude Norden attack. The math was brutal. To achieve even 20% accuracy at 25,000 feet would require 200-plus bombers. At extreme range, many wouldn't make it home. Losses to flak at high altitude would be catastrophic, and even with 200 bombers, 80% of bombs would miss, potentially destroying the Romanian countryside while leaving refineries operational. Smart did something that would have gotten him court-martialed if it hadn't worked. He threw out Doctrine. "We're going in at 200 feet, he announced to his planning staff. The room fell silent. "Sir," Major William Cameron finally said, "that's below the Norden's operational parameters. The site can't calculate bomb trajectory at that altitude." "Then we won't use the Norden," Smart replied. "We'll use delayed fuse bombs and aim by. Aye. Fly so low we can see the target clearly. Drop the bombs, they'll skip into the refineries like stones on water. We'll be gone before the Germans know we're there." The plan was insane by 1943 standards. Ultra-low altitude penetration, no Norden calculations, visual aiming only, using the world's most advanced bomber as if it were a dive bomber. But the physics made sense. At 200 feet, travelling at 200 miles per hour, bombardiers would have a clear view of their targets. Bombs with 45-second delayed fuses would skip or bounce into the structures before exploding. At that altitude, heavy flak couldn't depress low enough to fire. The Germans would be forced to use light guns, less deadly than the 88mm batteries effective at high altitude. Smart presented the plan to General Louis Brereton, commander of the 9th Air Force. Brereton's first response: "You're asking me to order 178 bombers to attack at the altitude where every rifle on the ground becomes anti-aircraft fire." "Yes, sir, but I'm also asking you to achieve actual target destruction rather than statistical hits in a 1,000-foot radius that leave the target operational." Brereton approved the mission. Operation Tidal Wave. The crews trained for 2 months in the Libyan desert, practicing ultra-low-level navigation and bombing. They removed the Norden sights entirely, replacing them with simple fixed sights welded to the nose frames. Bombardiers, trained for years in complex calculations, were taught to aim by eye. Lieutenant William Wright, bombardier with the 98th Bomb Group, described the transition in his diary. "Today they told us to forget everything we learned about the Norden. We're going to aim like World War I pilots, by eye and instinct. Fly low enough to see the target clearly. Release when it looks right." After 2 years of training on the most sophisticated bomb site ever created, we're bombing like barnstormers. But in practice runs, I'm hitting targets I couldn't touch from 20,000 feet. The psychological shift was profound. At high altitude, bombardiers felt isolated from the destruction they caused. The targets were abstract, circles on photographs, coordinates on maps. At 200 feet, they would see faces, buildings, individual structures. The disconnect between action and consequence would disappear. Captain John Palm, pilot with the 376th Bomb Group, addressed his crew before the mission. "At this altitude, you'll be able to see everything. Romanian farmers, German soldiers, the people in the refineries. Remember, we're not here to kill people. We're here to destroy oil production. The low altitude isn't about killing. It's about accuracy. We can put bombs exactly where they need to go without leveling the city around the target." August 1st, 1943. The force departed at dawn, 178 B-24 seconds, carrying 311 tons of bombs. The navigation was complex, 1,350 miles over water, mountains, and enemy territory, all at altitudes below 500 feet to avoid radar detection. They would climb to 200 feet only for the final attack run. The mission encountered immediate problems. One formation took a wrong turn, adding 30 minutes to the flight. The lead navigator's aircraft was shot down over the Danube. Several groups arrived at different times, losing the coordination essential to overwhelming defences. But when the first B-24 seconds thundered over Ploesti at 200 feet, the concept of low-altitude precision bombing was proven spectacularly, terrifyingly effective. Lieutenant Norman Whalen's bombardier's view, recorded in his after-action report. "We came in so low I could see men diving off catwalks. The refinery towers filled my view, no calculations needed, no Norden gymnastics. I could see exactly where the bombs needed to go. Released at 200 feet, 180 miles per hour. Watched them skip across the ground like flat stones on water. Counted 3 seconds and pulled up. Looked back to see the delayed fuses detonating inside the cracking units. Perfect placement, better than anything I'd achieved from 20,000 feet with the Norden." The 93rd Bomb Group attacked the Concordia Vega refinery. Bombardier reports indicated 76% of bombs striking within the refinery complex. Flames rose 300 feet. The refinery produced no oil for 7 months. The 389th Bomb Group hit the Stour Romana complex. At 200 feet, bombardiers could identify individual processing units. They aimed for the catalytic crackers, the heart of oil production. 61% of bombs hit within the target area. Production ceased for 4 months, but the cost was catastrophic. Of 178 bombers, 53 were lost. 532 men killed, captured, or interned in neutral Turkey. 5 Congressional Medals of Honor were awarded for the mission, more than any single action in Air Force history. The refinery damage was significant. 40% reduction in production capacity, some facilities offline for months. But within a year, Ploesti was producing at 85% of pre-attack levels. The strategic impact was less than hoped. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Yet Operation Tidal Wave proved something that would transform bombing doctrine. Low-altitude visual bombing achieved accuracy rates that high-altitude Norden attacks never matched. 76% accuracy versus 8%. The numbers were undeniable. The Ploesti results created a schism in Air Force leadership. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, reviewed the mission reports with his staff in Washington. 53 bombers lost, Arnold said. 30% casualties. That's unsustainable. But look at the accuracy, sir, Colonel Richard Hughes responded. 76% of bombs within target areas. We've never achieved anything close to that from altitude. At what cost? We can't lose 1/3 of every attacking force. Sir, we're losing 1/5 of forces on high-altitude missions and missing the targets. Ploesti actually destroyed what it aimed at. That's the first time we've done that in this war. The argument continued for weeks. High-altitude advocates pointed to the casualties. Low-altitude proponents pointed to the accuracy. The debate might have remained academic except for one factor. The men flying the missions began taking matters into their own hands. Bomber crews started requesting permission for low-altitude attacks on small precision targets. Marshalling yards, bridge junctions, fuel depots, targets where the Norden's complexity was wasted, but visual accuracy mattered. Colonel Leon Johnson, who had led the 44th Bomb Group at Ploesti and earned the Medal of Honor, became an advocate for tactical low-altitude operations. The Norden is magnificent technology. Johnson testified to an Army Air Force Review Board in October 1943, but it's solving the wrong problem. It gives us theoretical precision at altitudes where weather, flak, and human factors make that precision impossible. At 12,000 feet, a good bombardier with simple sights can see his target clearly and hit it. That's real precision, not theoretical precision. The review board's response was predictable. Maintain high-altitude doctrine for strategic targets. Consider low-altitude attacks only for tactical situations where defense is permitted. But in combat units, a quiet revolution had begun. Pilots and bombardiers were learning that altitude was a variable, not a constant. Different targets required different approaches. While Europe debated doctrine, the Pacific theater was discovering low-altitude bombing by necessity. Japanese targets in the southwest Pacific were typically small, dispersed installations, supply dumps, barges, airfields. The Norden was useless against such targets. Major William Benn, flying B-24 seconds with the 90th Bomb Group from Port Moresby, pioneered what he called masthead bombing, attacks from 200 to 300 feet against Japanese shipping. Without the Norden, bombardiers aimed by eye, releasing when the target filled their vision. Results were dramatic. Shipping attacks from 25,000 feet achieved 2% hit rates. Masthead attacks achieved 40% hit rates. Japanese vessels in Simpson Harbor, Rabaul, found themselves under attack from bombers flying so low that masts were higher than the aircraft. The 43rd Bomb Group developed skip bombing techniques using the same delayed fuse tactics Smart had employed at Ploesti. Bombs would skip across the water like stones, striking ships at the waterline. Accuracy rates exceeded 50%. General George Kenney, commander of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, embraced low-altitude tactics enthusiastically. His command had never had enough bombers for massive high-altitude raids. Precision attacks at low altitude with limited forces achieved better results than dispersed attacks from altitude. The Norden is a magnificent device, Kenney wrote to Arnold in December 1943, for conditions that rarely exist. In combat, give me bombardiers who can aim by eye from 3,000 feet, and I'll destroy more with fewer aircraft than any theoretical precision from 25,000 feet. By early 1944, the debate was reaching a critical point. Combat results from both theaters demonstrated that for many targets, low-altitude visual bombing achieved accuracy the Norden couldn't match. But casualties remained high, and doctrine remained unchanged. What would finally transform American bombing strategy wasn't the accuracy debate. It was the emergence of a target where high-altitude bombing's failures became catastrophic. Japan's cities. March 9, 1945. Guam. Brigadier General Thomas Power stood on the flight line watching B-29 superfortresses being loaded with something that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. Incendiary bombs. Not high-explosive bombs for precision attacks, not steel penetrators for destroying factories, fire bombs for burning cities. Tonight, 334 B-29 seconds would attack Tokyo not from 30,000 feet using the Norden sight, but from 7,000 feet using visual aiming. They would not target specific factories or military installations. They would target residential districts, urban areas where war production was integrated into civilian neighborhoods. It was the ultimate abandonment of precision bombing doctrine, and it would kill more people in a single night than any air attack in history. The journey from Norden precision to incendiary area attack represented the complete collapse of pre-war bombing theory. Understanding why required examining what happened when B-29 seconds first attempted high-altitude precision bombing against Japan. The B-29 was supposed to make the Norden bomb sight finally work as designed. Pressurized cabin meant crews could function clearly at 30,000 plus feet. Remote-controlled defensive guns meant no drag from turrets. Speed of 350 plus mph meant minimal exposure to flak. Range of 3,250 miles meant striking Japan from secure bases. And most importantly, the B-29 carried the Norden's latest evolution, the APQ-13 radar bombing system that could theoretically bomb through clouds using radar images of the ground. Major General Haywood Hansell commanded XXI Bomber Command when B-29 seconds began operations against Japan in November 1944. Hansell was precision bombing's true believer. He had written the doctrine, he had defended it through the dark days of 1943. Now, with the perfect bomber and the target that mattered most Japan's aircraft industry, he would prove that precision high-altitude bombing could win wars. The first mission, November 24th, 1944, targeted the Musashino aircraft engine plant near Tokyo. 111 B-29 seconds attacked from 27,000 to 33,000 feet. Only 24 bombers actually bombed the primary target. The rest bombed alternates, aborted, or brought their bombs home. Of the bombs that fell, fewer than 10% landed within 1,000 feet of aim points. The Musashino plant continued production uninterrupted. The problem was weather. Over Japan in winter, cloud cover existed 90% of the time. The jet stream at 30,000 feet created winds of 200+ mph that could blow bombers backward. Radar bombing proved almost worthless. Japanese cities on radar screens looked like indistinct blobs. Lieutenant Marcus McDilder, bombardier with the 497th Bomb Group, described the futility in his log. Mission 6. Target: Nakajima Aircraft Plant. OTA. Results: bombed on radar through solid undercast from 31,000 feet into 180 mph headwind. Used APQ-13 radar. Target looked like every other radar return. Released on best estimate, photos showed bombs scattered across 10 square miles. Maybe some hit the plant. Maybe. Lost 2 aircraft to mechanical failure. Accomplished nothing. Hansel flew 7 major missions in December 1944. Average accuracy: 5% of bombs within 1,000 feet. Average bomb on target: 2%. Japanese aircraft production increased that month. The mathematics were devastating. At current accuracy rates, destroying a single factory required 3,000 tons of bombs. The B-29 force could deliver perhaps 1,200 tons per mission. With weather, mechanical failures, and defensive losses, each target required multiple missions. Meanwhile, Japanese industry dispersed production into small workshops scattered through residential areas. By January 1945, XXI Bomber Command had flown thousands of sorties, lost dozens of aircraft, and achieved negligible impact on Japanese war production. On January 6th, General Curtis LeMay replaced Hansel as XXI Bomber Command commander. Curtis LeMay had commanded bomb groups in Europe. He understood precision bombing's promises and its failures. He had seen accuracy reports. He knew what high-altitude bombing actually achieved versus what it theoretically should achieve. LeMay reviewed 3 months of mission reports. His analysis was coldly mathematical. Current approach: attack from 30,000 feet using Norden, radar against specific industrial targets. Accuracy: 5%. Bombs on target per mission: 60 tons. Average. Japanese production impact: negligible. Alternative approach: attack from 7,000 feet using visual aiming against urban districts containing dispersed industry. Expected accuracy: 60% plus. Bombs on target per mission: 1,500 tons. Japanese production impact: catastrophic. The moral calculation was more complex. Precision bombing was supposed to minimize civilian casualties, but at 5% accuracy, bombs scattered randomly across cities anyway. The difference was intent versus result. High-altitude bombing intended to spare civilians but killed them accidentally. Low-altitude area bombing would kill them deliberately but achieve actual strategic impact. LeMay's chief of intelligence, Lieutenant Colonel Robert McNamara, the future Secretary of Defense, presented the analysis starkly. General, we can continue high-altitude precision attacks that miss their targets and kill civilians randomly. Or we can acknowledge that Japanese war production is integrated into residential areas and attack those areas directly. Either way, civilians die. The question is whether their deaths accomplish anything strategic. LeMay made his decision based on mathematics, not morality. If bombing was going to kill civilians regardless of altitude or intent, then bombing should at least be effective. The implementation would prove that low-altitude bombing could achieve accuracy. High-altitude attacks never matched, and kill on a scale that would haunt survivors for generations. March 9, 10th 1945. Operation Meeting House, the 334. B-29 seconds approaching Tokyo that night, carried no defensive ammunition, guns removed to save weight. They flew at 7,000 feet, low enough that crews could see details on the ground, and they carried M69 incendiary clusters 2,000 pounds per aircraft. Total load, 1,665 tons of fire. The target was not a factory or military installation. It was Tokyo's Shitamachi district, a 1-2 square mile area of densely packed wooden buildings where small workshops produced war materials alongside homes, shops, and schools. Lead bombardier Captain William Weigel didn't use the Norden. At 7,000 feet, visual aiming was faster and more accurate. As his B-29 crossed the city, he could see individual buildings, streets, intersections. The aiming point was a neighborhood crossroads, bombs away. The M69 clusters broke apart at 2,000 feet, releasing 1,520 individual incendiary bomblets that scattered across the district. Each bomblet contained napalm that burned at 2,000 degrees, impossible to extinguish with water. Within 30 minutes, firestorms had merged into a single conflagration. Winds of 60-plus mph created by the heat pulled oxygen toward the flames. Surface temperatures reached 1,800 degrees. Asphalt bubbled. Metal melted. The bombing accuracy from 7,000 feet was remarkable. Bombardiers could see their aiming points clearly and adjust in real time. Post-strike analysis showed 98% of incendiaries fell within the target area. Nearly perfect accuracy achieved with simple visual aiming. The human cost was catastrophic. Approximately 100,000 people killed in 6 hours. 16 square miles burned completely. 1 million people homeless. The deadliest air attack in history, exceeding even the later atomic bombings in immediate death toll. The strategic impact was equally significant. Japanese war production in Tokyo dropped 50% overnight. Dispersed workshops couldn't be dispersed from ash. Workers couldn't work from ruins. The industrial capacity that had been impervious to high-altitude precision attacks ceased to exist, and this result was achieved by abandoning the Norden bomb site for simple visual aiming at low altitude. LeMay didn't stop with Tokyo. Over the next 5 months, B-29 seconds conducted incendiary attacks against every major Japanese city using the same low-altitude visual bombing technique. March 11th, Nagoya, 1,790 tons of incendiaries, 3.8 square miles destroyed. March 13th, Osaka, 1,733 tons, 8.1 square miles destroyed. March 16th, Kobe, 2,355 tons, 3 square miles destroyed. March 18th, Nagoya again, 1,858 tons, 3 square miles destroyed. The accuracy achieved at 7,000 to 12,000 feet, with visual aiming exceeded anything accomplished with the Norden at high altitude. Bombardiers could see their targets, adjust for wind drift in real time, and place weapons precisely where intended. Major Robert Morgan, the same pilot who had bombed Schweinfurt at 25,000 feet in 1943, now flew B-29 seconds from Tinian. His assessment, recorded in an interview conducted in 1986, at Schweinfurt with the Norden from 25,000 feet, I had no idea where my bombs landed. Statistics said maybe 1 in 10 hit something useful. Over Japan at 7,000 feet without the Norden, I could see exactly where every bomb landed. The accuracy was perfect. The Norden had promised precision and delivered statistical scatter. Visual aiming delivered actual precision. We'd spent 3 years perfecting the wrong solution. By July 1945, Japan's 60 largest cities had been attacked, approximately 40% of urban area destroyed, industrial production had collapsed. The siege by fire had accomplished what precision bombing could not, actual destruction of Japan's capacity to wage war. The Strategic Bombing Survey conducted after the war concluded that low-altitude incendiary attacks achieved their objectives. Destruction of Japanese war-making capability. But the survey also concluded that these objectives could have been achieved with fewer civilian casualties through continued precision attacks against specific targets. This conclusion ignored the fundamental problem. Precision attacks had failed for 3 years. High-altitude bombing with the Norden never achieved its promised accuracy. Japan's dispersed cottage industry couldn't be destroyed by bombing individual factories that didn't exist. Lieutenant General Ira Ika, who had commanded the 8th Air Force in Europe and opposed area bombing, provided perhaps the most honest assessment. We discovered, too late, that the Norden bomb site was a magnificent solution to a problem that didn't exist in combat. Perfect accuracy from perfect altitude in perfect conditions. We built our doctrine around achieving perfection. Meanwhile, good enough accuracy from achievable altitude in real conditions was available all along. We just had to abandon our illusions. The post-war debate over strategic bombing focused on the morality of area attacks, but the technical question was equally significant. Why did it take 3 years to discover that low-altitude visual bombing achieved better accuracy than high-altitude Norden bombing? The answer involved institutional inertia, sunk cost fallacy, and the human tendency to defend investment regardless of results. The Norden bomb site cost $1.5 billion to develop, equivalent to $50 billion today. The Manhattan Project that built the atomic bomb cost $2 billion. America had spent nearly as much developing a bomb site as developing nuclear weapons. Admitting the Norden didn't work as promised meant admitting that investment had been wasted. Easier to blame weather, enemy action, crew training, anything except the fundamental concept. Bomber crews trained for years on the Norden. Training infrastructure, procedures, doctrine, everything assumed Norden bombing from high altitude. Changing required acknowledging that years of training had been preparing crews for a technique that didn't work. The precision bombing doctrine justified daylight operations that cost thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of lives. Admitting precision bombing failed meant questioning whether those losses had purpose. Psychologically, militarily, politically, that admission was almost impossible. So the system continued bombing from high altitude with the Norden long after evidence showed the approach didn't work. Only when results became undeniably catastrophic, months of bombing Japan with negligible effect, did leadership finally abandon the theory. By then, the war was nearly over. The lessons learned came too late. The B-24 low-altitude revolution, promised by the title of this piece, never fully materialized. Instead, the Air Force stumbled into low-altitude tactics reluctantly, implemented them inconsistently, and ultimately used them for area attacks, rather than the precision strikes they enabled. At Ploesti, B-24 seconds from 200 feet achieved 76% accuracy. In the Pacific, B-24 seconds from 300 feet achieved 40–50% accuracy against shipping. Over Europe, when B-24 seconds attacked tactical targets from 12,000 feet, they achieved 30–45% accuracy. All these results exceeded high-altitude Norden bombing by factors of 5 to 10. Yet doctrine never changed. Training continued to emphasize high-altitude operations. The Norden remained standard equipment, and when low-altitude bombing was finally adopted for strategic attacks, it was used for area incendiary attacks against cities, rather than precision strikes against military targets. The most tragic aspect, the capability existed from the beginning. Physics didn't change between 1942 and 1945. A bombardier at 12,000 feet could always see targets more clearly than from 25,000 feet. Bombs always fell more accurately over shorter distances. Visual aiming always worked better than complex calculations requiring perfect information. What changed wasn't capability. What changed was willingness to abandon theory. August 6, 1945, Hiroshima. The B-29 Enola Gay attacked from 31,000 feet carrying a single atomic bomb. The bombardier, Major Thomas Ferraby, used the Norden bomb site for the most important bomb release in history. The bomb detonated 550 feet off target. For an atomic bomb, close enough. For any conventional weapon, a miss. 3 days later, Boxcar bombed Nagasaki. The bombardier missed the aiming point by 1,800 feet. The bomb intended for the Mitsubishi Steelworks fell instead on the Urakami Valley. Still effective, given the weapon's power. Still a miss by precision standards. The atomic bombs ended the war, rendering the entire precision bombing debate moot. But they also provided the final demonstration of the Norden's limitations, even with the most critical target in history. With unlimited preparation time, with perfect weather and no opposition, bombardiers missed their aim points by margins that would have meant failure with conventional weapons. Post-war, the Air Force conducted extensive analysis of bombing accuracy. The findings, published in the Strategic Bombing Survey, were stark. High-altitude Norden bombing, average accuracy, 3.2% of bombs, within 1,000 feet. Low-altitude visual bombing, average accuracy, 35% of bombs within 1,000 feet. The Norden promised precision and delivered statistical scatter. Visual bombing from achievable altitude delivered actual accuracy. Modern precision weapons, laser-guided bombs, GPS guidance achieve 90% plus accuracy by acknowledging what World War II planners refused to accept. Bombing accurately requires certainty about target location, real-time adjustment, and acceptance that weather, enemy action, and human factors will always degrade theoretical perfection. The lesson of the B-24 low-altitude story wasn't about altitude. It was about the difference between theoretical perfection and practical effectiveness. The Norden represented the former. Visual bombing from 12,000 feet represented the latter. American bombers could have been achieving 30–40% accuracy from the war's beginning. The technology existed, the physics were understood. What was missing was willingness to abandon doctrine even when evidence showed it didn't work. How many missions flew achieving 3% accuracy when 30% was possible? How many crews died defending doctrine rather than accepting reality? How many targets remained operational because theoretical precision was valued over practical accuracy? The questions haunted post-war Air Force leadership. They should haunt anyone making decisions based on theoretical perfection rather than practical results. The B-24 pilots who started bombing from 12,000 feet tripled accuracy not through new technology, but through acknowledging reality. They abandoned the Norden's promise of perfection and accepted the good enough of visual aiming from achievable altitude. They proved that sometimes the best solution isn't the most sophisticated. Sometimes it's the one that actually works. The Norden bomb site was a triumph of engineering. Low-altitude visual bombing was a triumph of pragmatism. History remembers the engineering, but pragmatism won the war. Lieutenant James Chen, the bombardier from the opening, survived the war. In 1987, he was interviewed for an oral history project. Asked about the Norden bomb site, he laughed. "We treated that thing like it was magic. Secret oaths, security clearances, months of training. And you know what I discovered? On the missions where I actually hit something, I wasn't using the Norden. I was using my eyes, my judgment, and simple geometry. The Norden's calculations were perfect. They were just perfectly useless in combat. The day I became an effective bombardier was the day I stopped trusting the sight and started trusting myself. Low altitude helped because I could see what I was doing, but the real change was accepting that approximate accuracy you can achieve beats perfect accuracy you can't. We spent 3 years learning that lesson. Cost a lot of planes, cost a lot of men, but we learned it eventually. Better late than never, I suppose. Better late than never. But one wonders, how much better if the lesson had been learned when the first pilot noticed that bombing from 12,000 feet worked better than bombing from 25,000 feet. If doctrine had adapted to evidence rather than defending investment. The B-24 low-altitude revolution happened quietly, incompletely, too late to change the strategic bombing campaign's fundamental nature. But it happened, and it proved that sometimes the answer to how do we hit targets isn't more sophisticated technology. Sometimes it's just flying lower and looking more carefully. The Japanese pilots laughed at the Hellcat until it swept their Zeros from the sky. American planners believed in the Norden until reality swept that belief away. In both cases, war taught the same lesson. Theory bows to practice. Eventually. Usually too late. But inevitably. The B-24 pilots who bombed from 12,000 feet understood that lesson. They tripled their accuracy not through brilliance but through acceptance. Sometimes that's enough.